For a few minutes after that, Sunny was in a dark mood. But then he pulled himself out of it and inhaled deeply, trying to enjoy the fresh air. Indeed, air like that was hard to come by in the real world. Microdust and other pollutants made it rough and unpleasant, not to mention the general stench of the outskirts. In the better parts of the city, sophisticated filtration systems worked diligently. However, filtrated air tasted sterile and stagnant. Only the very rich had access to truly pleasant breathing. And here he was, able to enjoy an unlimited amount of pristine, delicious air like a second-generation Chable. Truly, being chosen by the spell has its benefits. If only there was no dreadful cold, his feet did not ache, and his wrists and back were not in agony. The slave caravan slowly dragged itself up the mountain, with more and more slaves stumbling and periodically falling to the ground. A couple of times, those who could not walk anymore were taken off the chain and unceremoniously tossed off the road, down into the abyss that loomed to the left of it. Sunny watched them fall with a bit of compassion. Poor fellows. Rest in peace, you pitiful souls. All in all, he was in good spirits. It was a bit strange to feel good amidst this disaster of a nightmare, but thankfully Sunny had time to prepare himself for this eventuality. When the symptoms of the spell first appeared, he did not handle it well. Dying before you even turned 17 was not something one could easily cope with. But in the end, it only took Sunny several days to come to terms with it. After visiting his parents' makeshift resting place. Well, actually, since he was too poor to afford even the cheapest slot in the remembrance facility, it was just 2 lines carved into an old tree. And adding a third line for himself, Sunny suddenly became relaxed and carefree. After all, he didn't have to worry about earning money, finding food, protecting himself, and planning for the future anymore. Once the worst that could happen had already happened, what else was there to fear? So, becoming a slave and slowly freezing to death was not that much of a shock. Besides, he knew the cold would not kill him. Simply because he had already seen what fate was awaiting the caravan further up the mountain. The picture of piled bones littering the ground was still fresh in his mind. Most likely, it was a pack of monsters that were going to do the caravan in, and by the look of it, the attack was going to take place in a matter of hours, not days. So he still had a chance. Using the opportunity, Sunny decided to take another look at his status and summon the runes again. The last time he was too outraged by the aspect and didn't study the attributes well. While not as important as one's aspect, the attributes were often the deciding factor between life and death. They represented one's natural traits and affinities, sometimes even providing passive abilities and effects. Fated. Attribute description. The strings of fate wrap tightly around you. Unlikely events, both good and bad, are drawn by your presence. There are those who are blessed and there are those who are cursed, but rarely both. Mark of divinity, attribute description. You bear a faint scent of divinity, as though someone briefly touched by it once, a long time ago. Child of shadows, attribute description. Shadows recognize you as one of their own. Interesting. Sunny quickly recognized the first attribute. Fated. As the main culprit of his predicament. At first glance, it seemed to indicate that he was destined for a certain fate. To die miserably and vanish without a trace, for example. But after reading the description, he realized that being fated actually just meant that improbable things had a higher chance of occurring when he was around. I guess this is how I managed to receive one of the super rare useless aspects, and a weird variant of it at that. If it fated was his innate attribute, then the other 2 came from the temple slave aspect. Mark of divinity was more or less straightforward. It was supposed to allow passage into certain sacred places inside the dream realm and enhance several types of sorcery. Since there were no sacred places in sight and Sunny's aspect had nothing to do with sorcery, it was useless too. Child of shadows was a stranger one. He had never heard of it and had no idea what it was supposed to do. At least not until the sun hid behind the mountain and the sky began to darken. To his surprise, Sunny found himself able to see perfectly in the darkness, as though it was still as bright as day. This ability alone was nothing to scoff at, and it was quite possible that Shadows would reward him with some other, yet unknown, gifts. Finally, something good. I wonder if... Stop the caravan. Prepare to camp. Following the head soldier's order, the slaves stopped and fell to the ground, shivering and exhausted. The small clearing where the road widened was somewhat protected from the wind by a protruding mass of rock. But it was still too cold to rest with ease. The soldiers got busy herding the slaves into a tight circle, forcing them to share warmth and lighting up a large bonfire in the center of the camp, although not before tending to their horses. The heavy wagon carrying food, water, and other cargo to which the main chain was firmly affixed was pushed forward to block the wind. While looking around, Sonny noticed the young soldier from before watching the mountain with a complicated look on his face. What a weirdo. Soon, the bonfire was blazing. The stronger slaves tried to find their way closer to the fire, while the weaker ones, like Sonny, were forced to sit at the outer end of the circle with their backs freezing in the cold. Of course, any movement was encumbered by the fact that they were still shackled to the chain. That's why the familiar broad-shouldered slave ended up just where he started despite all of his efforts to get closer to the flame. Damn Imperials, he hissed, clearly irritated. The soldiers walked among the slaves, giving them water and food. Sonny, just like everybody else, received a few sips of icy water and a small piece of rock-hard, moldy bread. Despite its unappetizing look, he forced himself to eat the whole thing, just to be left as hungry as he was before. By the looks of it, he wasn't the only one. The shifty slave that had been walking behind him looked around in anguish. By all the gods, they used to feed me better even in the dungeons. He spat on the ground, desperate. And most of us innocent men in the dungeon were there waiting to visit the gallows too. A few steps away from them, where the paved road ended and sharp rocks began, a scattering of bright red berries were growing from the snow. Sonny had noticed them before, clustering here and there along the road, and even noted how pretty those resilient things looked contrasted against the white. The shifty slave's eyes glistened as he tried to crawl towards the berries on all fours. I would advise against eating those, friend. It was the gentle-voiced slave again. Sonny turned around and finally saw him in the flesh for the first time. It was a tall man in his 40s, lean and strangely handsome, with a dignified look of a scholar. How a man such as him ended up a slave was a mystery. Yet there he was. You and your advice again. What? Why? The scholar smiled apologetically. These berries are called bluebane. They grow in the places where human blood was spilled. That's why there's always a lot of them along the slave trade routes. So what? The older man sighed. Bluebane is poisonous. A few berries might be enough to kill an adult man. Curses. The shifty slave flinched back and glared at the scholar. Sonny did not pay them a lot of attention. Because, while looking around, he finally recognized the site of the camp as the place where, in his vision at the start of the nightmare, the bones of the slaves were buried under the snow. And he was willing to bet that whatever it was that killed them all was going to happen soon. As if to answer his thoughts, a thundering noise rang from above. And in the next second, something massive came crashing from the sky. Turning in the direction of the thundering noise, many slaves rose their heads, only to see rocks and heavy shards of ice raining on them from above. They instantly panicked, lurching away in a cacophony of screams. Shadows happily danced on black stones as, entangled by the thick chain, those slaves fell to the ground and pulled others with them. Sonny was one of the few that remained upright, mostly because he was ready for something like this to happen. Calm and collected, he gazed at the night sky, his attribute-enhanced eyes piercing the darkness, and took one measured step back. In the next second, a piece of ice the size of a man's torso hit the ground right in front of him and exploded, showering everything around with sharp shards. Others weren't that quick. As ice and stones continued to rain, many were wounded and a few even lost their lives. Agonizing wails filled the air. On your feet, fools! Get to the wall. The veteran soldier, the one who had whipped Sunny a few hours before, was shouting angrily, trying to get the slaves to move towards the relative safety of the mountain slope. However, before anyone could heed his command, something massive came crashing down, sending a tremor through the stones beneath their feet. It fell right between the caravan and the mountain wall, plunging everything into silence for a few seconds. At first, it looked like a lump of dirty snow, roughly round in shape and as tall as a mounted horseman. However, once the creature unfurled its long limbs and rose, it towered over the stone platform like a nightmarish omen of death. That thing must be at least 4 meters tall, Sunny thought, a bit stunned. The creature had 2 stumpy legs, an emaciated, hunched torso, and disproportionately long, multi-jointed hands. 2 of them, each ending with a set of horrifying bone claws, and another 2, these ones shorter, ending with almost human-like fingers. The thing that at first glance looked like dirty snow turned out to be its fur, yellowish-gray and ragged, thick enough to stop arrows and swords. On its head, 5 milky, white eyes regarded the slaves with insect-like indifference. Beneath them, a terrible maw crowding with razor-sharp teeth was half open, as though in anticipation. Viscous drool was running down the creature's chin and dripping into the snow. What unnerved Sunny the most, though, were the strange shapes endlessly moving, worm-like, under the creature's skin. He could see them clearly because, unfortunately, he was one of those unlucky souls closest to the monstrosity, getting a nauseating first-row view. Well, that is just too much, he thought, stupefied. As soon as Sunny finished that thought, all hell broke loose. The creature moved, slashing its claws in his general direction. But Sunny was one step ahead. Without wasting a single moment, he jumped sideways, as far as the chain allowed, conveniently placing the broad-shouldered slave between himself and the monster. His quick reaction saved his life, as those sharp claws, each as long as a sword, sliced through the broad-shouldered man a fraction of a second later and sent streams of blood flying through the air. Drenched in the hot liquid, Sunny hit the ground, and his fellow slave, now simply a corpse, fell on him from above. Damn, why are you so heavy? Temporarily blinded, Sunny heard a chilling howl and felt an enormous shadow passing over him. Immediately after, a deafening chorus of screams filled the night. Not paying it any attention, he tried to roll the corpse to the side, but was stopped by a forceful lurch of the chain that twisted his wrists and filled his mind with white-hot pain. Disoriented, he felt himself being dragged a few steps, but then the chain suddenly slackened and he was able to control his hands again. See, things could have been worse. Putting his palms against the dead man's chest, he pushed with all the strength he had. The heavy corpse stubbornly resisted all his attempts, but then finally fell sideways, setting Sunny free. However, he didn't get to celebrate this newly found freedom as his blood suddenly turned to ice. Because at that moment, with his palms still pressed against the broad-shouldered slave's bleeding body, he clearly felt something wriggling under the dead man's skin. You just had to think about how things could get worse, right, you idiot? He thought, and then flinched back. Pushing the corpse with his legs, Sunny crawled as far away from it as he could hit, which was about 1.5 meters, thanks to the ever-present chain. He quickly glanced around, noticing a mass of dancing shadows and the silhouette of the monster rampaging amidst the screaming slaves on the opposite end of the stone platform. Then he concentrated on the dead body, which was starting to convulse with growing violence. On the opposite side of the corpse, the shifty slave was looking at it with slackened jaw and a horrified expression on his face. Sunny waved to get his attention. What are you staring at? Move away from it. The shifty slave tried, but immediately fell down. The chain was twisted between the 3 of them, pinned down under by the broad-shouldered man's weight. Sunny clenched his teeth. Right under his eyes, the corpse was going through a nightmare-inducing metamorphose. Strange bone growths pierced its skin, extending like spikes. The muscles bulged and wriggled as though trying to change shape. The fingernails were turning into sharp claws. The face cracked and split, bearing open a twisted mouth with one too many rows of bloodied, needle-like fangs. This is not right. Sunny twitched, feeling a strong urge to empty his stomach. The chain. The scholarly slave was just a few steps behind the shifty one, pointing at his shackles with a face as pale as a ghost. That remark was far from helpful, but given the circumstances, his shock was understandable. Being shackled was bad enough, but being shackled to such horror was truly unfair. But Sonny's conclusion that things weren't right did not come from self-pity. He just meant that this whole situation was literally not right. The spell, mysterious as it was, had its own set of rules. There were rules for what type of creatures could appear in any given nightmare, too. Nightmare creatures had their own hierarchy. From mindless beasts to monsters, followed by demons, devils, tyrants, terrors, and, finally, mythical titans, also known as calamities. The first nightmare was almost always populated by beasts and monsters, rarely with a demon mixed in. And Sonny had never ever heard about anything stronger than a single devil appearing in it. However, the creature had clearly just created a lesser version of itself. An ability that belonged exclusively to tyrants, the sovereigns of the nightmare spell, and those above them. What was this tyrant even doing in a first nightmare? How powerful was that damn fated attribute? But there was no time to ponder. Unfair or not, there was only one person now who could save Sonny himself. The broad-shouldered man. What was left of him, slowly rose, his mouth producing strange clicking noises. Without giving him time to fully come to his senses, Sonny cursed and jumped forward, grabbing onto the length of the slackened chain. One arm of the monster, now fully equipped with 5 jagged claws, shot forward to meet him, but Sonny sidestepped it with one calculated movement. What saved his skin this time was not quick reaction, but simple presence of mind. Sonny might not have learned any fancy combat techniques since his childhood was spent on the streets instead of a school. But the streets, too, were a kind of teacher. He had spent his whole life fighting for survival, quite often literally. That experience allowed him to keep a cool head on his shoulders in the midst of any conflict. So instead of freezing or being consumed by fear and doubt, Sonny just acted. Stepping close, he threw the chain around the monster's shoulders and pulled, pinning its hands to its body. Before the creature, still slow and groggy from its transformation, could properly react, Sonny wrapped the chain around it several times, barely saving his face from being bitten off by the creature's terrifying maw. The good thing was, the monster couldn't move its hands now. The bad thing was, the length of the chain he used to immobilize it was gone, leaving almost no distance between them. "You too," Sonny screamed, addressing his 2 fellow slaves. "Pull on that chain as though your lives depend on it." Because they were. The shifty slave and the scholar gaped at him and then, understanding what he was thinking, started to move, grabbing the chain from the opposite directions. They pulled as hard as they could, tightening its grip on the monster and not letting it shake loose. Great, Sonny thought. The monster bulged its muscles, trying to break free. The chain creaked, caught on the bone spikes, as though slowly breaking apart. Not so great. Without wasting any more time, he threw his hands in the air and caught the creature's neck with the short, thinner chain connecting his shackles together. Then he circled the monster with a quick step and pulled, ending up back to back with it as far away from its maw as he could. Sonny knew that he wasn't strong enough to strangle a man with his bare hands, let alone a weird, terrifying mutant like the one trying to eat him. But now, using his own back as a lever and the weight of his whole body to pull the shackles down, he at least stood a chance. He pulled down with all his might, feeling the monster's body pressing against him, bone spikes brushing against his skin. The monster continued to struggle, clicking loudly and trying to break the chain tying him down apart. Now it was just a question of what would break first, the chain or the monster itself. Die! Die, you bastard! Sweat and blood were rolling down Sonny's face as he was pulling and pulling and pulling down with as much force as he could muster. Every second felt like an eternity. His strength and stamina, what little he had to begin with, were quickly running out. His wounded back, wrists, and muscles pierced by the bone spikes were in agony. And then finally, Sonny felt the monster's body go limp. A moment later, a faintly familiar voice rang in the air. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. "You have slain a dormant beast, Mountain King's larva."